Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Galen Webcast series. At this point, I'm going to pass it off to Dan Williams to get started. Thank you for joining.
Hey, this is Dan Malden, though Dan Williams, I think. Are you there with me?
Yes, sorry, my phone was messing up. Yes, so I guess I'll start over. We'll be doing a presentation here on the maintenance and security of an EMR environment and talk about the finer points of each. The first thing we'll do is introduce ourselves, and then we will talk about why we need to have the EMR environment secure and efficient and well-maintained. We'll be talking specifically about the security measures that are taken with a typical EMR environment with both the technical and social aspects. And then we will talk about the maintenance, which typically comprises the automation and performance parts of it, as well as any sort of side strategies that you use to shore up your data. And then finally, we will end in a typical question and answer fashion. But first, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Daniel Williams. I've been at Galen for over 2.5 years. I'm a technical consultant here, and I have a background in both sort of technical support and security, as well as just general programming knowledge.
And I'm Daniel Malden, and I've been with Galen for almost a year now. Been in IT for professionally for about the last 13 years. And I hold my CISSP, my SSCP, and CEH certifications.
Very good, thank you. So, the first thing that we are going to discuss is just to give an overview of where we're coming from with this presentation. When we talk about EMR environments, we're sort of presuming that they are on-premise, which means that they are not hosted in the cloud necessarily. We're also going to be assuming that it is sort of database and application server structure. Usually a lot of these environments are set up so that there is a central database that manages all the patient and user data, and then there are application servers, and most typically like Citrix or web servers that plug into that. We're mostly familiar with the TouchWorks environment, the Allscripts TouchWorks environment, so we sort of go back and use that as an example. But there are a lot of EMR systems out there and that are set up in a similar manner. And this will also be primarily talking about a Windows environment because that's most of the experience that we work with, as well as most of the environments out there are Windows environments.
Yeah, and first we'll talk about security. And as you've likely seen, hospital hacks, they're in the news a lot lately. Though we would love to go into depth on each of these topics, though the truth is the presentation will be days, if not weeks long. So this webinar, it's going to be a mile wide, but only about 1 inch deep, meant to really get the conversation started about security and maintenance within your organization. And with that, first, let's talk about the difference between classic and, well, classic hacking and the current ransomware practices that are out there. Classic hacking refers to things like port scans, where somebody will look at your network for open ports as a possible avenue of attack. SQL injections, as like this little example here. Someone could use a form on your website, your externally facing portal, or just your main website, whether it be a ask question or contact us, where they can put in bits of code that can either break your site or dump data. And this is why you typically see something like a CAPTCHA, like enter this phrase or I'm not a robot button. And then there's the brute force or dictionary attacks. These are kind of what this sounds like, where they're using just brute force to go through a password, constantly trying different parts of a dictionary, like an actual dictionary with the words that combinations or commonly used passwords. And this is why having that that CAPTCHA is very important. Password decryption this is where somebody actually got into your system and stole your password file, and although it might be encrypted, they're going to use some software to decrypt that file or go through your hashes and see how they can find out those passwords to use later on. Manipulation of security questions, this is something more on the social engineering side. This is where you may have seen, celebrity's account was hacked, but really somebody just knew the answers to the security questions. Like what city were they born, or what's their mother's maiden name, or what's their favorite color, things that their social media may have. And physical infections, mainly through USB drives, whether it's somebody brings a USB drive from home, plugs it into the computer at work, not knowing that there was a malicious bit of software on there, and then now the company network is, our company environment is now infected. And this is why there's security measures policies you can have where drives are not, the USB drive is not enabled, USB plugs on the computers are not enabled. And this would be especially important in places like a hospital or an examination room where people can be left alone with computers for who knows how long, between waiting for a provider to come in there with them, leaving that system very much vulnerable.
Yeah, it's also publicly accessible too, obviously.
Yeah, publicly accessible areas or just public-facing areas where people can plug in those drives, whether it's an employee or somebody with nefarious intent.
Yeah, so typically the classical hacking that you see in the previous example, in a lot of cases is not as popular for a lot of the dark environment out there because a lot of hacking is done remotely and a lot of that is done overseas. So it's very difficult sometimes to get into networks that you're not supposed to be in. So even though the yield of classic quote-unquote hacking can get you a lot more records, such as breaking into databases and that sort of thing, what has become popular recently is what's called ransomware. Ransomware is where somebody gets some software into your environment, usually a virus or a worm or something like that, and it spreads across the network, and then once activated, will encrypt all the software on a particular machine so that you can no longer read it. And then typically what happens is that there's a notification on there where I just use hacker for lack of a better term. What they'll do is they'll post a notification and say, hey, if you want access to this data again, you need to email me bitcoins because they're untraceable, and then I will send you back the decryption key, and then you'll be able to get to your files again. Obviously, this is a huge interruption. It causes downtime, loss of productivity, and it can be a real problem. We'll get into a couple measures that you can take in your environment to sort of prevent that. But a lot of time the ransomware links or the ransomware software is initially spread because of phishing emails where somebody pretends to be somebody from like a CEO or somebody, sends a low-level person an email with a fake link in there, and then next thing you know, you've infected the environment. There was one hospital that was recently held up for ransom as well. Actually, the San Francisco Muni system was as well. But this has been happening a lot in the hospitals and medical groups. Like somebody just paid out, I want to say $73,000 to a hacker because they were able to hold their software at ransom. So just before we get into the security measures, we would like to know, when is the last time that your organization has had a security audit? You should be able to see the poll question in the webinar window. So if you just go ahead and click on one of those, that'll be very helpful. Because we like to get the conversation started about this sort of thing, because it's not something typically on everybody's mind all the time, but obviously it's extraordinarily important. I'll give you a minute to work on that.
Yeah, I'm watching the results come in. So I see a decent number within 6 months, which is good to see. and then about half that within a year, and just a little bit within 5 years, and no nevers so far. So that's what we like to see, and it's got a little less than half response, so we'll leave the poll open for a little bit longer. And then I suppose we probably should have put an answer in there for people who didn't know, as that's also a possibility. But yeah, so far we're up to about 29% within 6 months, and about 15% within a year. So hopefully we can get a few more responses. I don't want to leave the poll open for too much longer. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so. But I do want to thank everyone for answering up to this point.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk about that kind of thing because everybody's interested, and not too many people are sort of aware of you know, all the aspects that go into making a secure environment. So
we've got half responses. So I'm going to close the poll at this point. We have 29% within 6 months, 18% within a year, and 4% within 5 years. So looks like we've actually got some good security policies in place here.
Yeah, good that there's no nevers. That's...
Yeah.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, our recommendation would be at least once a year. For those of you that are, you know, sort of outside of that window, we recommend getting one soon. Because what can happen if you are caught, unfortunately, you can get a random HIPAA audit, and when you get a random HIPAA audit, they basically do their own sort of security audit, and then obviously that could be big business if your organization is not secure. I don't need to tell you that HIPAA violations are bad themselves. Obviously, if you get caught violating or displaying any kind of breach of compromised data, there could be financial repercussions, you know, in the form of fines. If a HIPAA violation is large enough, then it actually you have to notify the patients anyway if you suspect that their records have been compromised. But if it's a large enough one, you're required to file that with the Health and Human Services Department, as well as the local press. So the information is going to get out there to everybody if for some reason there is any kind of compromise. So that could be extraordinarily damaging, as you understand. One thing that I found rather interesting is I was researching sort of how the data gets out, and mainly gets out because the data is physically stolen. What this means is essentially somebody leaves their laptop in a car. If there's a medical office that gets robbed and they take the computers, that is a huge portion of why this data is stolen. There's also data disclosed through sort of like if you have a failure to have a business agreement with somebody and the data gets out there, that could be an issue, as well as data just being lost and not recovered. So the fines that you can incur from a HIPAA violation obviously are on the HIPAA website, and there are different degrees of having this data compromised that is essentially determined in court, and it's essentially determined based on whether or not that somebody could prove that your organization knew that there was a breach and did nothing about it, or if you didn't know, or if all the software that you were working with essentially was HIPAA compliant, but you got hacked anyway. You know, I mean, it's difficult to sort of to keep that stuff in line because, you know, I can't remember the phrase exactly, but it's something like if somebody is able to get a lock, somebody can make a key for it. So somebody, you know, can eventually find a way in. So because of that, I always recommend to clients that keep in mind that if the patient records can be compromised, then they will all be compromised. If somebody is able to hack in take your patient data, you have to be prepared for that. And obviously, you can do the math for how many patients you have, how many records there are, and how many violations you can incur because of that. So it's just something to keep in mind. You see reports of this all the time, that there were millions of records that were stolen last year, for example. In one particular firm, an oncology firm, there were 2.2 million just out of that patient base that were leaked out. To find the information for particular incidents, you can look at that link that I put in the window, and then on the Health and Human Services website, like I said, all the patients or all the organizations where they have over 500 patient records leaked or breached, I should say, it gets reported. So on this website, you can see a list of everybody and then how exactly that data got out. I don't know if you can see it in the window necessarily, but there is a little sort of arrow that you can click on to get more details. But you can actually also just download this entire report into an Excel spreadsheet, and that has a much easier read for finding out exactly how these particular breaches happen. And it'll be something like, you know, provider left their laptop in a car and somebody broke into the car, or somebody's cousin walked into the office and walked out because they were trying to make a quick buck. That sort of thing. It's actually pretty interesting, so I recommend looking into that. But the way to essentially reduce the amount of incursions into your network will be a few policies that we recommend that you take.
Right. So account management is a big part of your network, your security infrastructure, and there are several accounts that users can have to maintain within their organization. So you have your database if they're a sysadmin, you have your analytics system for doing reporting, you have the Windows logon to get into the computer, then you have the actual EMR. So all of these different accounts, sometimes, or the portal actually too, all these different accounts could have different passwords or different ways to get into them, and having a good account management policy set in place is really invaluable. And there's different ways of consolidating account management with technologies and just also administratively, but LDAP, Active Directory, your single sign-on or SSO, where one password can get into several systems, whether it be your email is the same as your portal logon, or to get into Windows. So having all those different accounts put into one place is a good way of managing accounts, but it can also be a larger security flaw, a larger security hole that if that one password is lost, then you have more access to, or people have more access to PHI, potentially.
Yeah, so I would actually add to that you know, when you're consolidating the accounts, that you sort of have separate security groups to make sure that nobody can get into anything that they shouldn't. So like, you know, providers don't necessarily need to get into reporting groups, and reporting groups don't need to necessarily get into clinical data groups, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly, and this is the least privilege idea within security. So users only get the access that they need, and you want that to also be controlled by you know, how they get approved. You don't want people to be able to give themselves access. There has to be a good policy structure for approval and also assigning that permission or that access. And you want to have it documented. So one group typically is best to be able to do this account management. And having those in place, you want to make sure that you're within HIPAA compliance also, which having a tightly secured account management, account access is part of that.
Yeah, so the software that's in your organization, as well as you know, sort of having tied together accounts, you also want to make sure the compliancy for HIPAA regulations is on Health and Human Services website, but essentially it boils down to making sure that all the data that comes in and goes out is encrypted. All the data that is any kind of resting data in a database or anything is also encrypted. That there's nothing that's sort of sitting out, you know, on any file or any, or even in on your physical desk. You know, having patient MRNs or anything like that, you're not going to want to have that information out there. So it's always good to make sure that you keep that stuff in line, as well as
that goes also for.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say also that goes with the clean desk policy, and also even at the you know, sign-in desk at a hospital or at a clinic. That all is part of your HIPAA compliance. So not only the technical part, but there's many. The HIPAA compliance is a large umbrella.
Yeah, and you also want to make sure that all of that stuff is recorded in audit trails, because when a HIPAA audit comes through, one of the things that they'll do is they will check to see who has access to what and who has gotten into what, and what have they looked at and what have they done. So it's something that's very important to keep in mind. You want to make sure that all the software that you're working with has the capability to provide this information if it's produced. And obviously, you want to monitor it internally as well, not so much just for the HIPAA portion of it, but just to have a better sense of security on there. So because of that, you want to make sure to hire somebody. If you want to go into that, Dan.
Yeah, hiring somebody to review and test your access. And this would be, you may have heard of a penetration test or a pen test or a security audit. But having a third party that's not biased, that can come into your organization and test these things, a white hat hacker, so to say, versus a black hat hacker who is nefarious. The white hat hackers are basically just as capable as the black hat, but they're able to tell you your vulnerabilities and not exploit them. So they'll be able to look at your externally facing network and do those SQL injections, or they'll try to social engineer your people. They'll try calling your help desk and getting passwords reset. They'll try to go into your doors with, you know, by piggybacking. So having a firm that does all of that for you and it's not biased, they'll set you straight with not only exposing those vulnerabilities, but also help you with an audit. Let's say if you were audited for a HIPAA compliance report, and they're going to just save you from being a victim.
Yeah, definitely. And then another thing to make sure with that, so that you are not a victim, is to make sure that you train all of your employees at all levels on what Dan mentioned was social engineering, as well as how to identify if somebody's getting a spam email. A lot of the times, because I don't have to tell you, the people in the medical industry are perpetually busy. There is no shortage of work to do, that's for sure. And because of that, people want to resolve situations quickly. So if somebody was trying to breach your organization, they're going to call somebody, pose at somebody else, and just try to say, you know, well, hurry up, I need to get this information right now, my patient's waiting. And then that can cause people to sort of be lax in their vigilance, to you know, keeping track of who's getting access to what. So it's very important that you train everybody on the fact that this does happen. A lot of times, you know, people that are trying to get data will do this kind of thing. Like there's a couple of examples where, not necessarily in the medical field, but there was a Coca-Cola breach a few years ago that was sort of famous in the security world, where somebody just read some company news on the website that was public facing, and then reached out to a C-level employee to find out more information about internal practices, and then use that information to steal a bunch of user data from their online portal. There was also a situation with another company where sort of the reverse happened, where somebody posed as an executive and reached out to the finance department and said, you know, because of this particular project, we need money wired to a certain location or a certain account, and they ended up wiring $39 million to that account. And that's, you know, those are just two incidents. I mean, if you keep up on the news, it gets pretty scary, but it's not impossible to avoid. provided that everybody is trained properly. The reason why I mentioned that, specifically training all levels of employee is because the people who are not necessarily customer facing, the people who are not necessarily on the front lines of the medical industry may not think that they could ever be targets for something like this, and they most certainly can. As well as preventing them from getting socially engineered, or as I mentioned, errant clicks with emails. Email and firewall and message filtering is also extraordinarily important. You want to make sure that the software that you're using is robust enough to have multiple settings and be able to filter for certain kinds of content. I used to work in the security industry, specifically with anti-spam for a while, so I got to see basically sort of all the tricks that come out there, and it's very easy to fool somebody if they're not expecting it. So you want to make sure that there is good message filtering, good data filtering. And then although you'd think that doesn't need to be said, you want to make sure that all the software that everybody is using, especially the operating system software, the Windows updates, are all current. One of the things that Galen does, one of the services we provide, is doing technical assessment for an environment. And we have seen, I think there's only been one environment out of the bunch that we've looked over the years that was actually current on their updates. Most everybody is behind, if not on all of their servers, on a lot of the crucial servers. So like your database server, for example. And I think a lot of the reason for that is that downtime is typically you try to mitigate that, you try to minimize the downtime. But in the case of updates, it's just something you have to do, because if you're behind on security updates, that can be a huge problem eventually. So with updates, we will then go into talk about the actual maintenance and performance aspects of your environment. So with that, we have another poll question. So essentially, when was the last time that you had either a workflow or a technical performance assessment? So I'll give you a couple minutes to fill that out. You can monitor that, Logan.
Yep, the poll is open. And again, we're looking at the same time frame on this. So within 6 months, within a year, 5 years, and never. And this I feel like might be one that we don't see as frequent, simply because, like, everybody's heard of security audits, or at least they should have, and are aware of general computer security. Whereas a workflow optimization or assessment you might not even think of. Like, you've been through the training, you have your system set up the first time, but as new products get added in or you start working on different systems, things may change a bit there. And so what we're seeing so far is 20% within 6 months, 13% within a year, 3% within 5 years, and at this point, no nevers. So we'll leave a little bit more time to open this up. We still have about a third of the responses in, so we'll aim for at least 50% response rate on this. But yeah, the workflow optimization can be a huge thing, especially for a larger organization where even minor adjustments, when added up over a large number of users and a large number of days, it's going to have a big effect on the overall performance.
Yeah, one of the things that we've noticed when we've done our assessments is that a lot of the time clients will have sort of like an initial scoping for their environments to see exactly how much technical horsepower they need for the number of patients that they see. But then the environment is not necessarily scaled up accordingly later on. So a couple of years into it, 5 years into it, say your medical group is reaching great success and they end up acquiring other medical groups, and your patient population can explode because of that, and that's not necessarily taken into account when the scaling is done.
So it looks like
talk about that.
It looks like we're not getting too much more in the way of responses, so I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So, as stated in the beginning of the presentation, when we talk about EMR environments, as I mentioned, we usually talk about the database and application server structure. And with that, because they're typically run out of regular Windows servers, you want to make sure when you are shoring up the performance of your environment and to keep it optimized, to keep it running smooth, you want to have the proper software to monitor the states of all of those things. We found that when we've done some assessments in the past, certain medical groups that are not necessarily aware of what their actual peak times during the day are, and because of that, a lot of the environments get scaled for just a regular patient population, but not patient population during peak time when most of the activity is going on in the office. So we'll see like a lot of technical spikes that'll come up where servers are getting maxed out, and it makes the system slow. So even though the patient population may be a certain amount, the software that is running it is not able to serve their needs as quickly as it should. So so we do run into a lot of situations like that. So it's very important to monitor when your peak times are happening and what all of your servers are doing. In addition to that, the application servers that you have in your environment, or old legacy servers, database servers, they all need to be sort of kept up at the same time, not only for performance check, but also for security. When I worked in antivirus software before, antivirus and anti-spam, we always found that when an organization would get infected, one of the main reasons why they got infected is because the malware made its way onto some random server in some closet somewhere that people have forgotten about, that came out of purchasing another group or something like that. And what would end up happening is that particular server would also spread the malware. So it's important to keep track of what is entirely going on in your environment. And then with that, most of that software is going to have a notification system set up for it, specifically for emails. Setting it up with your email server is very important to do. We've seen a lot of situations where the software will have alerts to send out. I know Allscripts TouchWorks has one. There's an application called Support One, which monitors a lot of the database health. Looks for things like print jobs that are running out of control or backing up. If there are any database maintenance jobs that are failing, if there are hard drives that are filling up on space, if one machine is generating too many errors, that sort of thing. So it's good to get those notifications in your environment because you want to make sure that nothing is running out of control. But we do see a lot of situations where some of these notifications are just turned off for some reason. Maybe nobody wanted to set it up when the application was being initially installed, but for whatever reason, you want to make sure to have that enabled. Another important aspect of it is automating some of the most mundane and repetitive tasks. Do you want to talk on that, Dan?
Yeah, and the example on here for resetting passwords, if you ask any help desk, they're going to tell you that their most common call is going to be resetting passwords. So if you're able to automate that process, just like how websites have that, click here if you forgot your password, that can be set up within Windows environments. And if that's successfully set up and works out, then you're going to free up the ability of you're going to free up time from people having to wait on hold to speak to your help desk, and also free up your help desk to get the calls that are about system outages or about important tasks. Not to say that a locked out password's not important, but if somebody can do it automated, do it by themselves without having to wait on hold, you're going to make people happy. And of course, some of those things are going to be a phone call, but that's just one of the automated things that can really save time. There's also other things that can be done for performance with your database server or other servers. Just they're periodically reviewed for performance. Having that done, and also reviewing the structure of your environment. So you don't want to have, if you can avoid it anyway, you don't want to have multiple systems running on the same server. Dan mentioned this with just the performance part, but if you have everything running on the same server and that server goes out, then your environment's out. And it can also help with reducing the performance load or the task load. Like let's say, or actually an example is I saw a client's machine, their database server was also their DNS server and their Active Directory server and their DHCP server. So all of those tasks are going after that performance aspect of that server. So if DNS is going to break, or DHCP breaks, or Active Directory, one of those systems goes out, then that's their network right there, and it's also going to be affecting their EMR performance. So if you're able to break those apart, I understand that some environments, some smaller practices anyway, can't afford that. That's understandable, but if you're able, definitely do that. That's a big way to increase your performance right offhand. And then also having a DBA or somebody go through some health scripts on your environment. And this would be checking the query time or rebuilding indexes or other optimization software packages that are out there or queries that are out there. Can really tell you how your performance is on your database server, especially if your organization has grown from the time it was first spec'd out to how it is now. And this has happened with practices taking on other practices and also just expanding. Their system was set up to work for 1,000 patients, but now they have 2,000 patients or 10,000 patients, and et cetera, et cetera. The system just can't handle that load. So having the performance reviewed periodically, it's invaluable, really.
Yeah, especially when you have it automated and you have it set up to sort of compare against, say from like a year ago or so, so you can properly monitor how far it's growing. I've heard from clients that's sort of like a huge benefit that they see. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, so then speaking about databases and sort of division of labor, we also want to talk about things such as backup strategy. Yeah,
having a good backup strategy is crucial. Having regimented backup windows, so at least with your database, most systems or anyway are going to be backed up hopefully daily, at least daily. If it's on a full backup, then it's going to be doing it more periodically than that. But being able to go to a solid backup strategy is crucial for keeping your system up and running, especially in the event of an outage or in the event of, let's say, if you did have some kind of malicious attack on your environment. If you have a good backup strategy that you can roll back to, that really helps out. That's really invaluable. Losing a little bit of work versus losing all of your data is there's really no comparison to cost. And
yeah, like just real quick, like an example of that, I was reading about there was a practice that actually had they got a ransomware infection, and the person wanting for you to free up the data, they were asking for some exorbitant amount of money that the practice didn't necessarily want to pay for. So essentially what they ended up doing is they were able to clean the malware off of most of the environment, and because they had solid backups, they were just able to restore it right off the bat. They were still sort of down in a lot of areas for about 5 days or so, which obviously you don't want any lost production, but they ended up just not settling with the ransomware hacker, and basically isolated the machines and fixed it. But the thing is that this is only going to work for certain environments. Not everybody's going to necessarily be able to pin that down. So having backups that are relatively recent are really good, because then you can just restore the backup and then you know, figure out how the ransomware got in and blocked it from happening in the future.
Right, and
anyway,
and also,
talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And the fact that the ransomware was there, you know, who's to say if you did pay the ransom that, one, they're even going to give you the key, because one, they're doing an illegal activity as it is, and two, you know, not to say that they're going to do it again, and now you're targeted and now you're out there. So if you just didn't pay that and you went your own route and went back to backups that you had and just avoided the whole paying them and dealing with that whole part of it, then you're going to be in better shape for the future and less likely to be an easy target, because the people who are targeting these organizations, they're just looking for easy payout, you know, playing the numbers on who's going to pay versus just continuing, you know, going after the same person after the same person. So it's whatever is going to be easiest payout, and having a good backup strategy it just goes hand in hand with that. And
sure. Yeah. And also you know, people in the dark corners of the internet out there, you know, they tell each other, they talk to each other, and they say, hey, I was able to hit XYZ hospital because, you know, John Anderson clicked on this link. So make sure to email John Anderson and get him again. And, you know, so yeah, the strategy like that can be huge for saving that sort of thing, as well as just for just any kind of data corruption. Data corruption can happen at any time, and if there is any kind of corruption that happens, you want to make sure that you have good disaster recovery. A lot of clients that we know that we worked with have data centers either on site or somewhere, you know, local to them that stores, you know, if they even have a disaster recovery plan, you know, a lot of times they just try to keep that kind of thing local. So what ends up happening is that, you know, natural disasters are going to happen in an area. So if, I think, Dan, you were saying that there was a client you were working with that had 2 data centers, but they were essentially just across the street from each other. You know, and that can pose a problem if there is some kind of weather disaster or you know, somebody's trying to obviously get into the environment. They could just, you know, walk from one side of the street to the other to get into the other amount of data. And, you know, so it's something you need to have a plan to mitigate this kind of thing. One of the products that Galen offers is called Vital Center, and we've installed it with clients so that if for some reason they have any kind of like database server that goes down, or if the data center has a power outage or something like that, essentially the software will simulate the record environment, so that all you have to do is just switch over to use this other group of data, and then you're back up. Like, there are clients that have been working with a software that say that they were able to get back up within an hour or so, as opposed to being out a day or even more because their data center failed. So it's sort of like an insurance policy that's extremely helpful for that kind of thing. And with that, you know, we talk about all these different pieces of software and all the data that goes along with them. And one of the very important parts that we want to sort of get it drilled into everybody's head is that everybody is constantly acquiring more software that they know what to do with. The EMR market out there, I want to say last time I checked, there were about 500 different EMR solutions alone, and that's just the EMR system. That doesn't count PM, that doesn't count financial management, nothing like that. So with each one of those, you're going to have all kinds of solutions out there, and then most of the solutions that you see that are divergent like that are going to be from smaller groups. And what happens in smaller groups? They get bought up by bigger groups. And when bigger groups inherit them, they inherit everything that comes along from the smaller group. So you now have to manage the applications that are used in that smaller group, and you are going to want to consolidate a lot of that data, as well as the access for each one of those applications. We put up in the slide earlier just sort of a visual representation of all the different kinds of applications that can come in from various medical groups. And managing that kind of thing can be a huge pain. One of the things that we talk about with clients a lot when they pull this data in, Galen actually has a long, I would say very successful history of data migration. So essentially when you get these old legacy systems in from another group, we have helped clients very proficiently. I think it's like 700 or 800 data migrations that we've done now, where you're able to pull in the data from the old system, and then you can essentially shut down the old system because you don't need it anymore. To facilitate that even further, because there are requirements now for keeping the data around for a certain amount of time, rather than have this old server in a corner with all this, thousands of dollars of licensing and software that you have to keep up, as well as paying the manpower to manage those servers. You're going to want to archive that data. And then what we've seen a lot is that some of the archival solutions out there may not necessarily keep the data in a way that is that facilitates sort of easy use in the way that it preserves the data as the original thing, or in the original structure. Like in a lot of data migrations that we've worked with, because some of the systems are just so starkly incompatible with each other, you essentially end up having to lose some information just because it just won't work with the new system. So we've come out with software, Vital Center Online Archival, to actually consolidate that kind of thing, and it saves a lot of money for licensing fees, for just management headaches, and ultimately can make your EMR environment much more streamlined and much more secure, because you're not having to manage 30 different applications and the 200 per accounts that go with each one of those applications. So you can understand and you can visualize exactly how much difference that this can make in your organization. But it's an ongoing process, and it's something that we love working with our clients to sort of work through these solutions. It's kind of our bread and butter. It's what we enjoy. But I think that's going to cover it. We obviously, this was a very general overview discussion. For any one of these topics, you can have hours-long discussions on the individual aspects of any of these things. So yeah, we would love to speak with anybody later on if you want to get in touch. If you have any questions now, of course, we'll be more than happy to answer them. I know we cover a lot of different topics and a lot of different arenas, so it can be kind of daunting. So does anybody have any questions? Anybody put anything in there?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions, Dan. The first one that we have is, what do you find is the most common thing that slows down an EMR?
I would say with, I know from the environments, the environmental assessments that we've seen, and just with the projects that we've worked with, I would say that the database server horsepower is probably the biggest hindrance, because it's where all the data is centrally organized, all the applications plug into it, and if it's not able to pull up the data fast enough for the environment, then that could be a real issue. It can grind everything to a halt if you're not careful. Would you agree with that, Dan? Have you seen a similar?
Yeah. So the not only just the lack of database power, but it's also how the environment's configured. So I mean, it could be a super powerful EMR or the database server, but if their network is the bottleneck on that, if they have too many things going in and out of that server, like the example I gave with the DNS and the DHCP and App Directory, everything being on that same machine, it's going to be a bottleneck for information going in and out. So it's going to affect everything. And yeah, it's definitely the server itself. The environment is what slows down those environments.
Yeah, cool. It's funny that you say the thing about the networking, because yeah, I've seen where some database servers won't have enough network cards to go into it, and that could be a big bottleneck too. But anyway, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah, and we've got one other question at this point. Where do you see the weakest points security-wise in organizations?
I would say it's definitely social engineering. That goes to the whole phishing part, you know, knowing how to look at an email and know if it's a phishing email or know if it's a legit email, knowing how to not give too much information, especially if it's PHI information. Social engineering for sure. People are the weakest link. You can make something as secure as you want, but it's ultimately a person that's going to be controlling it.
Yeah, actually.
If you had other points, Dan.
Yeah, so you know, as external contractors work with a lot of clients, and we work within a lot of environments and with those clients, and a lot of time we end up having to work with their help desk to gain access to their environment. And I've sort of mentally noted and you know have said something where if I'm trying to get access to you know a set of servers because I have to do something, you know I'll say, hey, I'm working with Galen and I need access to this server. And I kid you not, 9 times out of 10, the IT help desk there, because they're probably not trained on social engineering because they're supposed to know better, or I should say, they're expected to have that expertise, but nobody can really train you for that kind of thing if you're not expecting it. So, so I've just sort of mentally noted when they've asked me to validate information, or you know, say like a lot of time if we provide some personal information to that organization so that we can validate it. Most of the time it doesn't get asked. They just say, oh, okay, well, which user account are you using? Well, that kind of information can be found very easily, especially if your organization, you know, just uses like a first name dot last name or first initial last name as a username. So yeah, we see gaps in that a lot, and we try to bring that to our clients' attention so that they're aware of it and they can sort of make things more secure.
Yeah, and Dan, actually, good thing you said that word aware, because most organizations do have some type of security training, some type of awareness training, but awareness versus actual change in behavior are 2 different things. So that help desk, they may very much be aware of the potential for a social engineering attack or what it is, but until they actually change their behavior, you know, like you could be aware that a seatbelt is going to protect you in an accident, but until you actually put it on, it's not going to do anything. So yeah. It's definitely being aware, but also actually implementing that change in behavior, that being part of your policy.
Yeah, staying vigilant for sure.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan and Dan. I don't see any other questions at this point, but when you exit the webinar, if you do have something that you'd like to contact us about, the Galen website will pop up with a contact form. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining the Galen Webcast series, and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
And thank you for watching. Hopefully we'll speak with you soon.
Yeah.